The rancher's boots stopped in the alley dust when he heard a mother's whispered prayer over a crust of bread. 3 small faces looked up at him from the shadows behind the saloon, their dark eyes hollow with hunger, their clothes threadbare against the Montana cold. And in that moment, Caleb Thorne made a decision that would unravel every wall he'd built around his heart. Pack your things. We're going home. Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Have you ever walked past someone in desperate need and wondered if you should have stopped? Have you ever been that person others walked past? This story is about the moment everything changes when one person decides to see another's humanity. If you've ever needed saving, or saved someone else, drop a comment below. And if this story touches your heart, subscribe so you never miss these powerful true-to-life tales. Now, let's see how one decision in a dusty alley changed 2 broken families forever. The autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and cattle across Redemption Ridge, Montana Territory, as it had every October since the town clawed itself into existence 15 years prior. Caleb Thorne guided his horse through the main street with the same grim efficiency he did everything. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, eyes forward. At 4-2, his face was weathered leather, his hands scarred from rope and iron, his reputation as solid as the Rocky Mountains that framed his 10,000-acre spread. He was in town for supplies, nothing more. The general store visit took 20 minutes. He ordered what he needed: flour, coffee, ammunition, salt pork, paid in cash, and arranged for delivery. The storekeeper, nervous as always around Caleb, stammered his thanks. Caleb touched the brim of his hat and turned to leave. That's when he heard the sound. It came from the alley between the saloon and the assayer's office, a soft, desperate sound that most men would have ignored. But Caleb Thorne had learned long ago that the worst kind of trouble often started with a whisper. He paused, one hand resting on the rough wooden post outside the store. His jaw tightened. "Keep walking," he told himself. "Not your concern." The sound came again. A child's cough, wet and rattling. His boots moved before his mind caught up. The alley was shadowed, the afternoon sun not reaching into its narrow confines. At first, he saw only the usual debris: broken crates, discarded bottles, a rusted bucket. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw them. 4 figures huddled against the saloon's back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of empty barrels. 3 children he could tell by their size, and 1 woman, her back to him, her shoulders wrapped in a shawl so worn he could see through it in places. She was whispering something, her voice low and rhythmic. A prayer, he realized. She was praying over something in her hands. Caleb took 3 steps closer, his boots crunching on gravel. The woman's head snapped up. She turned, positioning herself between him and the children, her chin lifting in defiance despite the fear that flickered across her face. She was black, her skin deep brown even in the shadows, her hair pulled back beneath a faded kerchief. Her eyes dark and fierce locked onto him with a pride that poverty couldn't extinguish. She couldn't have been more than 30, but hardship had carved lines around her mouth that added years. "We're not causing trouble," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We'll move along." Caleb didn't respond. His attention had shifted to what she held. A crust of bread, stale, by the look of it, probably swept from the saloon floor that morning. Behind her, 3 children pressed against the wall. The oldest couldn't have been more than 9, a girl with her mother's eyes and defiant chin. The middle child, a boy of perhaps 6, clutched his sister's hand. The youngest, another boy, couldn't have been more than 4. His face was streaked with doubt, and his cough rattled in his thin chest. They were all staring at the bread in their mother's hands like it was a feast. Something cold and sharp twisted in Caleb's gut. Rage, maybe, or grief, or something worse, recognition. He'd seen starving cattle, seen horses worked to death, seen men broken by this unforgiving territory. But children? How long? His voice came out rougher than he intended. The woman's shoulders stiffened. "That's not your concern. How long since they ate?" He took another step forward. She didn't retreat, but her hand tightened on the bread. "We manage." That's not what I asked. For a long moment, they stared at each other, two people who'd learned not to trust easily, not to bend, not to show weakness. The wind whistled through the alley, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The smallest boy coughed again, and Caleb's decision crystallized. There's a restaurant 2 doors down, he said, reaching into his pocket for coins. Take them. We don't take charity. The woman's voice could have cut glass. It's not. I said no. She gathered the children closer, preparing to leave. We'll be fine. Caleb watched her turn away, watched her shoulders set in that rigid pride that was somehow more heartbreaking than begging would have been. He watched the children follow, their steps slow, their eyes lingering on his face with a mixture of hope and learned disappointment. And in that moment, he heard it not with his ears, but with some part of himself he'd thought was long dead. His wife Martha's voice, clear as if she stood beside him. You know what's right, Caleb. You've always known. Wait, he said. The woman stopped but didn't turn around. Caleb's mind raced. He lived alone in a ranch house built for a family he'd never had. He had rooms that hadn't been opened in 5 years. He had a bunkhouse where his ranch hand stayed, separate from the main house. He had land that stretched to the horizon and money in the bank that meant nothing because he had no one to spend it on. He had everything and nothing. These people had nothing and everything they had for each other. The equation was simple. The solution was terrifying. I have a ranch 20 miles north of here, he heard himself say. The Circle T. I need help with the house cooking, cleaning, and mending. The children could help with light chores, learn ranch work, room and board, plus wages. Now she did turn, suspicion written across every feature. Why? Because I'm tired of my own cooking. It was partially true, because the place is going to hell without a woman's touch. Also true, because winter's coming and those children won't survive it living like this. Completely true. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, the trick, the price that always came with a man's offer. He let her look, keeping his face impassive, letting his words stand on their own merit. I don't know you, she finally said. Name's Caleb Thorne. Own the Circle T Ranch. Been here 15 years. Ask anyone in town about my character. He paused. They'll tell you I'm hard, but they'll also tell you I'm fair. I don't lie, don't cheat, and I keep my word. And if I say no? He looked at the children, then back at her. Then I'll watch you walk away. But we both know winter's 3 weeks out, and pride doesn't keep children warm. It was harsh. It was also true. The oldest girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering something. The woman closed her eyes briefly, and Caleb saw the exact moment her pride bent, not broken, never broke, but bent enough to let survival in. 1 month trial, she said. If it doesn't work, we'll leave. No questions, no trouble. Fair enough. Caleb extended his hand. What do I call you? She hesitated, then took his hand. Her grip was firm despite her circumstances. Josephine Coleman. Joe. These are my children Grace, Thomas, and Samuel. Mrs. Coleman. He touched his hat brim, then looked at the children. You 3 ready for a real meal? The transformation was instantaneous. 3 pairs of eyes lit up with cautious hope. Thomas, the middle child, nodded so hard Caleb thought his head might fall off. The restaurant first, Caleb said. Then we'll get supplies and head to the ranch. Wagons outside the livery. As they walked back toward the main street, Caleb found himself acutely aware of the stairs. A white rancher with a black woman and 3 black children. In 1883 Montana, that would generate talk. Talk would generate judgment. Judgment would generate trouble. He'd dealt with worse. What he hadn't dealt with was the feeling that was slowly, painfully unfurling in his chest like something frozen was beginning to thaw, and the sensation was both wonderful and terrifying. At the restaurant, he ordered them food and watched as they tried to maintain dignity while clearly wanting to devour everything in sight. Joe cut her children's food with practiced efficiency, serving them before taking a single bite herself. Grace, the eldest, kept glancing at Caleb with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Thomas ate like he might never see food again. Samuel, the youngest, fell asleep before finishing, his head drooping against his mother's arm. Caleb paid the bill, arranged for additional provisions to be added to his wagon, and led them to the livery. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains as they rolled out of Redemption Ridge. Joe sat up front with him, the children nestled in blankets in the wagon bed. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, as the ranch buildings appeared on the horizon, Joe spoke. "Why, really?" she asked quietly. "There's more to this than bad cooking." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "I lost my wife and unborn child 5 years ago. Fever took them both in the space of 3 days. Since then, I've been—" He searched for the word. "Existing. Not living. Just existing." He pulled the wagon to a stop before the main house, a solid 2-story structure that had weathered 5 hard winters and stood strong. "Saw you and your children in that alley, and I realized I had a choice. I could walk away and stay dead inside, or I could do something right. Something good. Something Martha would have wanted." Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. "It's hard work running a ranch, and I'm not an easy man to be around. I'm rough, blunt, and I've forgotten how to be soft." "Good," Joe said, accepting his hand to step down. "Because I'm rough too. I'm blunt too. And I don't need soft. I need safety. I need my children fed and warm and with a chance at something better than what we've had." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Recognition. 2 people who'd been broken by life and were trying, in their own ways, to piece themselves back together. "Well then," Caleb said, lifting a still sleeping Samuel from the wagon. "Welcome to Cycle Tea." As he carried the child toward the house, Grace and Thomas followed behind with their mother. Caleb felt that thaw in his chest deepen. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was, he thought, the first step toward something he'd stopped believing in 5 years ago. It was the first step toward home. The first week at the Circle T passed in a blur of adjustments, unspoken boundaries, and careful navigation. Joe proved to be exactly what she'd claimed: rough, blunt, and fiercely capable. She attacked the neglected house with a determination that bordered on fury, scrubbing years of bachelor grime from surfaces Caleb had forgotten could shine. She reorganized the kitchen with ruthless efficiency, threw out supplies that had gone bad, and made lists of what was needed in a neat, precise hand that surprised him. "You can write," he'd said, watching her inventory the pantry on the 3rd day. She'd given him a look that could freeze whiskey. "My father was a freedman who believed education was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen. He taught me to read and write before I was 5. Any other assumptions you'd like to share?" Caleb had the grace to look charged. "No." "Good." She turned back to her list. "Because I've got a lot of work to do, and I don't have time to correct every foolish notion that wanders through your head." He'd almost smiled. Almost. The children were a different matter entirely. Grace, at 9, was already half feral with independence. She followed Caleb around the ranch like a shadow, asking questions about everything: the cattle, the horses, the land, the business of running it all. She absorbed information like parched earth soaking up rain, and her eyes gleamed with an intelligence that made Caleb think of merchants and lawyers, not ranch hands. "Why do you brand the cattle?" she asked one morning, watching him work. "So we know which ones are ours. Cattle roam, mix with other herds. The brand proves ownership." "But couldn't someone just change the brand? Add it to it?" Caleb paused, genuinely impressed. "That's called brand blotting. It's rustling, and it's a hanging offense. But yes, it happens. That's why our brand is simply hard to alter without being obvious." Grace nodded, filing the information away. I want to learn the books, the ranch accounts. Why? Because knowledge is wealth that can't be stolen. She said it like scripture, like something deeply believed. And because Mama says I'm good with numbers. Caleb studied her, this fierce, brilliant child who'd been eating garbage a week ago and was now asking to learn bookkeeping. All right. Every Sunday evening, after supper, I'll teach you. The smile that broke across Grace's face was like sunrise. Thomas, the 6-year-old, was quieter but no less determined. He attached himself to Caleb's foreman, a grizzled Mexican man named Javier who spoke more Spanish than English and communicated mostly through gestures and grunts. Somehow, Thomas and Javier formed an immediate bond, the boy following the old cowboy around, learning to care for horses, muck stalls, and move with the careful efficiency required around large animals. The boy has good hands, Javier told Caleb one evening, his English careful and deliberate, gentle but firm. The horses trust him already. Young Samuel, still weak from malnutrition and chronic illness, spent his days recovering. Joe kept him close, feeding him carefully measured portions. Too much too fast would make him sick, she explained, and treating his cough with herbs and poultices that actually seemed to work. Slowly, color returned to his cheeks. His eyes brightened. His laughter, when it came, was like music the ranch hadn't heard in years. But it was the evenings that changed everything. Caleb had been alone for 5 years. His routine was sacred, unchanging work until dark, eat whatever he could throw together, sit on the porch with whiskey, sleep, repeat. The silence had been his companion, his comfort, his cage. Now, the house rang with life. Joe cooked meals that made Caleb remember what food was supposed to taste like. The children did their chores, then gathered at the large kitchen table for lessons, Grace with borrowed books, Thomas with slate and chalk, Samuel with blocks and simple words. Joe taught them in the evenings, her voice patient but firm, accepting no excuses for laziness but celebrating every small victory. Caleb found himself drawn to the kitchen, pretending to need coffee or to check something, really just wanting to be near the warmth, the life, the sound of a family. On the 8th night, Joe caught him lingering in the doorway. You could join us, she said, not looking up from correcting Grace's arithmetic, instead of hovering like a ghost. The children froze, uncertain. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Don't want to intrude. You're not intruding. It's your house. Joe finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. Unless you prefer being alone. Did he? He'd thought so for 5 years, but standing in that doorway, watching this small family exist in his space, Caleb realized the truth was more complicated. No, he said quietly. I don't. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Samuel immediately climbed into his lap, unself-conscious in the way only small children can be, and showed him the blocks he'd been stacking. Caleb's hands, scarred and rough from ranch work, looked massive against the child's small fingers. He helped Samuel stack the blocks, the simple task somehow profound. Grace showed him her arithmetic, hungry for approval. Thomas told him, in excited, stumbling words, about the foal that had been born that afternoon. Joe said nothing, but Caleb caught her watching him with something that might have been cautious hope. That night, lying in his bed in the darkness, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Peace. The trouble started on a Saturday, 3 weeks into their arrangement. Caleb had taken Joe and the children into town for supplies. Winter was closing in fast, and they needed heavier clothing for the children, more provisions, and various household items Joe had listed in her meticulous handwriting. They barely entered the general store when the whispers started. Caleb had expected it. Montana Territory in 1883 was complicated, not quite the Deep South, but not exactly progressive either. There were black families in the territory, freedmen who'd come west seeking opportunity. But a white rancher with a black woman and children living under his roof? That raised eyebrows and questions. Let them talk. He'd dealt with worse. What he hadn't expected was confrontation. It came in the form of Vernon Pritchard, a neighboring rancher whose spread bordered Caleb's land to the east. Vernon was loud, opinionated, and had never much liked Caleb's refusal to join in on his schemes, usually involving questionable land deals and cattle of dubious origin. Well, well, Vernon said loudly, making sure half the store heard him. Caleb Thorne's got himself a new housekeeper. Must be paying well for her too. What did you call it? Keep house. The innuendo was clear. Ugly. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, felt the old rage cold and controlled rising in his chest. Beside him, Jo had gone very still, her hand tight on Samuel's shoulder. Careful, Vernon, Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. You're about to say something you'll regret. Am I? Vernon swaggered closer, emboldened by his audience. I'm just wondering what exactly Mrs. Coleman does to earn her wages. Must be something special to have you taking in her and all those. Caleb moved. One moment he was standing by the counter. The next, he had Vernon by the collar, slammed against the wall hard enough to rattle jars on nearby shelves. His forearm pressed against Vernon's throat, not enough to choke, but enough to make breathing difficult. Listen very carefully, Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. Mrs. Coleman is my employee. She runs my household, cooks, cleans, and manages things I'm too incompetent to handle myself. Her children work the ranch, loan trades, and earn their keep. That's all. That's everything. And if I hear one more word, one more suggestion from you or anyone else, I will make it my personal mission to destroy you. Am I clear? Vernon's face had gone red, then purple. He nodded frantically. Caleb released him, stepping back. Vernon gasped for air, one hand to his throat. The store had gone absolutely silent. Caleb turned to the storekeeper, who looked terrified. Add whatever Mrs. Coleman needs to my account. All of it. And if anyone gives her trouble when she shops here, anyone at all, they'll answer me. He looked around the store, meeting every eye that dared to look back. That goes for everyone. The Colemans are under my protection. Treat them with respect, or don't treat them at all. Choose wisely. He turned to Jo, who was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Get what you need. Take your time. I'll be outside. He walked out, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the effort of not doing worse to Vernon Pritchard. Outside, he leaned against the hitching post, breathing hard, trying to calm the storm inside him. He'd known there would be talk. He hadn't realized how much it would enrage him to hear Jo insulted, to see her dignity questioned, to watch her children witness ugliness they didn't deserve. When did they stop being employees and become, what? His responsibility? His family. The thought was terrifying. 20 minutes later, Jo emerged with packages. Grace, Thomas, and Samuel followed, all three children subdued. They loaded the wagon in silence. As Caleb prepared to drive them home, Jo touched his arm. Thank you, she said quietly. But you didn't have to. Yes, he interrupted. I did. And I'd do it again. Nobody talks about you or your children like that. Nobody. Jo's eyes searched his face, and slowly something shifted in her expression. The wariness that had never quite left eased fractionally. You're a good man, Caleb Thorne. I'm a man who keeps his word, he corrected. And I gave you my protection when you came to my ranch. That means something. Yes, Jo said softly. It does. On the ride home, Samuel fell asleep against Caleb's side, his small body trusting in a way that made Caleb's throat tight. Grace peppered him with questions about the confrontation. Why did you defend us? Do you think Mr. Pritchard will cause more trouble? What if people stop doing business with you? And Caleb answered each one honestly. I defended you because it was right. Pritchard might cause trouble, but I've weathered worse. And if people stop doing business with me over this, then they weren't worth doing business with in the first place. Thomas, surprisingly, asked the question that cut deepest. Do you really think we earn our keep? Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to look at the boy. Thomas, in the 3 weeks you've been at the Circle T, You've learned more about horses than some men learn in years. You work hard, never complain, and show respect to everyone you meet. Yes, you earn your keep. Don't ever doubt that." The boy's smile was radiant. That night, after the children were in bed, Joe found Caleb on the porch. He was sitting in his usual chair, but the whiskey bottle was absent. She settled into the chair beside him, Martha's chair, unused for 5 years, and for a long while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. "I need to tell you something," Joe finally said, "about my husband, about why we ended up the way you found us." Caleb waited, not pushing. "James was a good man," she began, her voice soft. "We met in Kansas, married, and had Grace. He worked the mines hard, but was honest. We saved every penny, dreaming of buying land, starting a farm. Then the mine collapsed." Her voice caught. 17 men died. James was one of them. "I'm sorry." The mining company paid nothing, called it an unfortunate accident, blamed the workers for not following safety procedures. That was a lie. They'd known the supports were failing for months, but fixing them would have cost money. Bitterness edged her words. "We had nothing. I had 3 children and nothing. Tried to find work, but people see a black woman with children and they see burden, not capability." She paused, gathering herself. "We ended up in Redemption Ridge 2 months ago. I did washing, mending, and any work I could find. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough when you—" She gestured at her skin. "When you're this, in this world. So we made do. We survived. Until you found us." Caleb absorbed this, the weight of it settling heavy on his shoulders. "Grace asked me earlier why I defended you today. Want to know what I didn't tell her?" Joe turned to look at him. 5 years ago, when Martha died, something in me broke. I thought it was permanent. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life going through motions, pretending to be alive. Then I saw you in that alley, and something shifted. You and your children reminded me that life continues, that there's still good worth fighting for." He met her eyes. "You didn't just take a job at my ranch, Joe. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Joe spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens when the month is up? The trial period?" Caleb had been thinking about that question for days. The answer terrified him because it meant acknowledging how much had changed, how much he'd changed. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that maybe we could make this permanent. Not just employment, but family. Real family. You and the children stay, not as servants, but as partners in this ranch. I teach Grace the books. Thomas can train as a horse handler. Samuel can grow up here, strong and healthy. And you." He hesitated. "You can have the security you need, the respect you deserve." Joe was very still. "And what would people say?" "I stopped caring what people say 5 years ago when I buried my wife. Let them talk. Let them judge. This ranch is mine, built with my hands and my sweat. I decide who belongs here. And we belong." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, at the strength in her bearing, the intelligence in her eyes, the dignity that poverty and prejudice couldn't touch. He thought of Grace's laughter, Thomas's diligence, Samuel's trust. He thought of meals shared, evenings filled with life instead of silence, mornings that held purpose beyond mere survival. "Yes," he said simply, "you belong." Joe's eyes glistened with tears, and she refused to let fall. "Caleb Thorne, you are either the best man I've ever met or the biggest fool in Montana territory." "Probably both," he admitted. She laughed, then a real laugh, full and genuine, and Caleb realized it was the first time he'd heard it. It was a beautiful sound. "All right, then," Joe said, extending her hand. "Partners." He took her hand, shook it firmly. "Partners." They sat together on that porch, 2 broken people who'd found unexpected healing in each other's company, and watched the stars wheel overhead. The night was cold, winter breathing down from the mountains, but inside the house behind them, warmth glowed from the windows, and life's precious, hard-won life continued. Caleb Thorne had thought his story ended 5 years ago in a cold bedroom with whispered goodbyes. He'd been wrong. It was only just beginning. Winter came to Montana Territory like an invading army, relentless, unforgiving, and absolutely indifferent to human suffering. By late November, snow blanketed the Circle T in white that stretched to the horizon. The temperature plummeted to depths that froze breath in lungs and turned exposed skin dangerous within minutes. Caleb's cattle huddled in protected valleys. The ranch hands worked in shifts to keep them fed and alive, and the main house became an island of warmth in a frozen sea. Inside, life had transformed into something Caleb barely recognized and couldn't imagine living without. Grace had proven herself a natural with numbers. Every Sunday evening, as promised, Caleb taught her the ranch accounts. She absorbed everything: profit margins, supply costs, cattle prices, seasonal variations and expenses. Within a month, she was catching errors he'd missed and suggesting efficiencies that actually saved money. "You're wasting money on grain from Morrison's supplier," she said one evening, tapping the ledger with pencil. "Mrs. Chen at the mercantile gets hers cheaper and it's better quality." I asked. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You asked?" "Last time we were in town. I talked to people. Pay attention to prices. It's just math, Mr. Thorne." She said it like it was obvious. "Just math," he repeated, amused. "Grace, when you're older, you're going to run circles around every businessman in this territory." The pride on her face was incandescent. Thomas had become Javier's shadow, and under the old cowboy's patient tutelage, the boy was developing into a genuinely skilled handler. He had a gift for reading horses, understanding their moods, their fears, and their personalities. Even the most temperamental animals gentled under his small, confident hands. "Sun done," Javier told Caleb one afternoon, watching Thomas work with a skittish mare. "A gift cannot be taught, only recognized. Think he'll be better than you one day." Javier's weathered face cracked into a rare smile. "Already is, in some ways. He has no fear, but also no foolishness. It is a rare combination." Samuel, the youngest, had blossomed from the sickly child Caleb had first carried into the house. Proper food, warmth, and Joe's devoted care had worked miracles. His cough had vanished, color filled his cheeks, and his laughter rang through the house daily. He followed everyone around: his mother, his siblings, Caleb, the ranch hands absorbing everything with the wide-eyed wonder of a child discovering the world was bigger and better than he'd known. But it was Joe who truly transformed the Circle T. She ran the household with efficiency that bordered on military precision, but also with warmth Caleb had forgotten a house could hold. She organized the kitchen, managed supplies through the harsh winter, cooked meals that brought ranch hands to the main house with excuses to check on things just so they could smell what was cooking. She mended clothing, kept accounts of household expenses, and somehow made a bachelor's neglected house feel like a home. More than that, she challenged Caleb in ways no one had dared in years. "You're being stubborn," she said one evening in late December, hands on hips, facing him down over the kitchen table. They were arguing about expanding the herd come spring. Caleb wanted to maintain current numbers conservative, safely. Joe thought they should increase by at least 20%. "I'm being cautious," Caleb countered. "Expansion means risk. Everything means risk. But you've got the land, the water, the infrastructure." Grace ran the numbers to show him. "Baby." Grace eagerly spread out her calculations, explaining profit projections, market trends, and comparative analysis with neighboring ranches. Her math was sound. Her logic was irrefutable. Caleb studied the numbers, then looked at Joe, who was watching him with that expression he'd come to know, the one that said she'd already won the argument and was just waiting for him to realize it. "Fine," he conceded. 20% expansion. But if it goes wrong? "It won't," Joe said confidently. "Trust me." And he did. Somewhere along the way, he'd started trusting her judgment as much as his own. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The Christmas season brought unexpected joy to the Circle T. Caleb hadn't celebrated in 5 years. He'd let the holiday pass unacknowledged, just another cold day in an endless winter. But Jo had different ideas. "The children need Christmas," she said firmly when he tried to dismiss the whole thing. "They've had 2 years of nothing. This year they get something." So Caleb found himself riding into town through a snowstorm to purchase gifts. He enlisted the help of Mrs. Chen at the mercantile, explaining awkwardly what he needed. For the girl, something educational but special. The older boy needs. "I don't know anything for working with horses. The little one just needs toys, I guess." Mrs. Chen, a tiny Chinese woman with shrewd eyes and a kind heart, smiled. "And for Mrs. Coleman." Caleb hadn't thought about that. "She's not it's not like that." "Of course not," Mrs. Chen said in a tone that suggested she didn't believe him for a second. "But still, something nice. A woman works hard. She deserves acknowledgement." She helped him select gifts, a beautiful leather-bound ledger and fine pencils for Grace, professional riding gloves and a horse grooming kit for Thomas, wooden toys and a picture book for Samuel. For Jo, Mrs. Chen suggested a fine wool shawl, deep blue, warm and practical but also beautiful. "She'll love it," Mrs. Chen assured him. "Trust me." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Jo had decorated the house with pine branches and red ribbons. She'd somehow managed to bake cookies and prepare a feast despite the limited supplies. The house smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke and something indefinable but precious, happiness, maybe. That evening, after a dinner that had everyone groaning with contentment, they gathered in the living room. Caleb had never lit the fireplace in there. It was Martha's room, preserved like a shrine. But Jo had gently, respectfully cleaned it, and now fire crackled on the hearth, casting warm light over the assembled family. Family. That's what they'd become. Caleb distributed gifts with uncharacteristic nervousness. He'd never been good at this sort of thing, even with Martha. Grace unwrapped the ledger and pencils with reverence, running her hands over the leather binding like it was gold. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "You've earned it," Caleb said gruffly. "And maybe you could call me Caleb, if you want." The smile she gave him was worth every penny the ledger had cost. Thomas received his gifts with typical boy enthusiasm, immediately putting on the gloves and testing their fit. "Can I use these tomorrow? When do we work with the horses?" "That's what they are for." Samuel tore into his presence with the uninhibited joy of a 4-year-old, immediately engrossed in the toys. But then he did something unexpected. He climbed into Caleb's lap, clutching his new book, and said, "Read to me." Caleb's throat went tight. He looked at Jo, who nodded encouragingly. So he read haltingly at first, then with growing confidence while Samuel cuddled against him and the other children listened, and Jo watched with an expression that made his heart do complicated things. When he finished, he handed Jo her gift. She unwrapped it slowly, and when she saw the shawl, her breath caught. "Caleb, this is too much." "It's not enough," he said honestly. "You've given me so much more than I can ever repay. This is just a token, a small thank you." Jo draped the shawl over her shoulders, and even in the firelight, Caleb could see her eyes were wet. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for finding us, for bringing us here, for giving my children a home." "Thank you," he counted, "for accepting, for trusting me, for bringing life back to this place." They sat by the fire late into the evening, the children eventually falling asleep in various positions, Samuel in Caleb's lap, Thomas leaning against his mother, Grace curled in a chair with her new ledger. The adults sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the crackle of burning wood and the wind outside. "Caleb," Jo said eventually, her voice quiet, "can I ask you something personal?" "Always." "When you look at us, at me and the children, what do you see?" It was a loaded question. Caleb considered it carefully. I see strength, he finally said. I see dignity. I see a woman who refused to break even when everything tried to break her. I see children who are smart, capable, and kind despite every hardship they faced. I see. He hesitated, then pushed forward. I see family. Joe was silent for a long moment. Even though I don't care about that, Caleb interrupted, understanding what she wasn't saying. I never have. Character matters. Heart matters. Everything else is just noise. Not everyone thinks that way. No, he agreed. But I do. And this is my ranch, my home, my rules. Joe smiled, sad and hopeful at once. You're a rare man, Caleb Thorne. Just a man who was lucky enough to walk down the right alley at the right time. Fate, Joe murmured. Maybe, Caleb conceded. Or maybe just grace, of one kind or another. He looked down at the sleeping child in his lap, at the family gathered in firelight, at the life that had somehow, miraculously, grown from the ashes of his grief. And he realized that he'd been wrong about something fundamental. He'd thought his capacity for love had died with Martha and their child. He'd thought that part of him was buried forever. But love wasn't a finite resource. It wasn't something that ran out. It grew. It adapted. It found new forms, new expressions, new ways to root itself in the human heart. He loved these people, this woman, these children, not the same way he'd loved Martha that was its own sacred thing, but just as deeply, just as truly. And that was okay. Martha would have wanted this. She would have loved Joe, adored the children, filled this house with laughter and light. In some way, by opening his home and heart to the Colemans, Caleb was honoring her memory better than he ever had by shutting himself away. Merry Christmas, Joe, he said softly. Merry Christmas, Caleb. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, blanketing the world in white. Inside, fire burned warm, and the family found, chosen, loved, and rested safely. The Circle T Ranch had weathered another winter, but more than that, it had come alive again. What would you have done if you'd found Joe and her children in that alley? Would you have walked away, or would you have had the courage to change your life to save theirs? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment. Spring came late to Montana in 1884, but when it arrived, it brought transformation. The snow melted in rushing torrents, filling creeks and rivers, turning the prairie into an ocean of grass and wildflowers. The cattle, lean from winter, began to fatten on new growth. Caleb's ranch hands worked from dawn to dusk with the business of carving season, branding, and preparing for the drive to market. The Circle T thrived. Grace's projections had been conservative. The expansion Joe had pushed for was exceeding even optimistic estimates. New calves were healthy, survival rates were excellent, and the combination of Caleb's experience and Grace's analytical approach to ranch management was proving devastatingly effective. We could expand even more next year, Grace said one evening, showing Caleb her projections. She was 10 now, but her mind operated at a level that would shame most adults. If we leverage current profits to acquire better breeding stock and improve infrastructure. Slow down, Caleb said, amused. Let's master this expansion before we plan the next one. But, Grace. He softened his tone. You're brilliant, and your instincts are sound. But ranching isn't just about numbers. It's about patience, timing, and reading the land. Trust me on this. She considered, then nodded. All right, but I still think we're being too cautious. Noted, Caleb said dryly. Your objection is recorded in minutes. She grinned, and Caleb marveled not for the first time at the transformation in this child. The hollow-eyed girl who'd clutched stale bread in an alley 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a confident, brilliant young woman in the making. Thomas, now 7, had become indispensable to ranch operations. Under Javier's continued mentorship, The boy could gentle the wildest horse, diagnose lameness at a glance, and work with an efficiency that belied his age. The ranch hands had taken to calling him El Susurrador, the Whisperer, because of his uncanny ability to calm spooked animals. Samuel, at 4 going on 5, was simply happy. He followed everyone around, helped where he could, and filled the ranch with constant chatter and laughter. His favorite activity was sitting on the porch with Caleb in the evenings, asking endless questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where do the stars go in the daytime? How many cows do we have? What's your favorite color? Do horses dream? Caleb answered every question with patience that surprised even himself. He'd discovered he actually enjoyed the boy's curiosity, his unfiltered view of the world. Jo had become the backbone of the entire operation. She managed the household, yes, but also the ranch finances, supply ordering, and coordination with Caleb on major decisions. They'd fallen into a partnership that worked seamlessly. He handled the cattle and land, she handled everything else, and together they made the cycle team more successful than it had ever been. But there was something else growing between them, something neither had acknowledged aloud. It lived in lingering glances across the dinner table, in hands that brushed accidentally and lingered fractionally too long, in conversations that stretched late into the evening, neither wanting to say good night, in the way Caleb's heart lifted when he heard Jo's voice, the way Jo's face softened when she looked at him. They were both aware of it. They were both terrified of it, because acknowledging it meant confronting the reality of 1884 Montana, where what they were feeling was not just socially unacceptable but actively dangerous. The confrontation came in May, on a bright Saturday afternoon. Caleb had taken Jo and the children to town for supplies. It was their monthly trip, and by now, most of Redemption Ridge had grown accustomed to seeing them together. Mrs. Chen greeted them warmly. The banker nodded respectfully. Even the restaurant served them without incident. But there were always those who couldn't let things be. Vernon Pritchard had been stewing since Caleb had humiliated him 6 months prior. He'd been spreading poison subtle at first, then increasingly blatant. The Colemans weren't really employees, he claimed. There was something improper happening at the cycle tea. Caleb Thorne had lost his mind, bringing those people into his home. Caleb had ignored it. He'd weathered worse than gossip. But Vernon wasn't content with gossip anymore. They were leaving the general store, packages loaded in the wagon, when Vernon appeared with 3 of his ranch hands, big men, armed, looking for trouble. "Thorne," Vernon called out, his voice carrying across the street. "We need to talk." Caleb positioned himself between Vernon and his family. "Nothing to talk about, Pritchard." "I disagree. See, some of us are concerned about the situation at your ranch." Vernon's smile was ugly. "About propriety. About what kind of example you're setting." "The only example I'm setting is minding my own business. Suggest you do the same." "Can't do that. See, when a man brings a colored woman into his house, makes her his partner," Vernon said it with heavy innuendo that affects the whole community, "makes us all look bad." Behind Caleb, he heard Grace's sharp intake of breath, felt Jo's hand on his arm, warning or restraint. He wasn't sure. "Last chance, Vernon," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. "Walk away." "Or what? You'll defend your whore." Caleb didn't remember deciding to move. One moment he was standing by the wagon. The next, his fist connected with Vernon's jaw with a crack that echoed off the buildings. Vernon went down hard. His ranch hands moved, but suddenly Javier was there, along with 2 of Caleb's other men who'd been at the saloon. The odds had shifted. Caleb stood over Vernon, every muscle coiled, fury burning cold in his chest. "You will never speak about Mrs. Coleman that way again. She is a lady, more of one than most white women in this town, and she deserves respect. If you can't give it, stay away from her, away from me, and away from my ranch." Vernon spat blood. "The law. The law says I can run my ranch how I see fit, employ who I choose, and defend my people from slander. You've slandered Mrs. Coleman. In front of witnesses. Want to take this to the sheriff?" I'd be happy to file charges. Vernon's face had gone pale. Slander was a serious charge, and Caleb's reputation was spotless while Vernon's was not. This isn't over, Vernon muttered. Yes, Caleb said flatly, it is. Because if you come near my family again, and yes, Vernon, that's what they are, my family, I will destroy you. I'll buy out your creditors, undersell your cattle, and make sure you can't do business in this territory. I have the money and the connections to do it. Test me if you want. He extended his hand to help Vernon up. Vernon slapped it away and stumbled to his feet, his men helping him retreat. The street had gone silent. Half the town had witnessed the confrontation. Caleb turned back to his family. Grace looked shaken but fierce. Thomas was wide-eyed. Samuel clung to his mother's skirt. And Joe was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Let's go home, Caleb said quietly. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The children sensed the tension and stayed quiet. Joe sat rigid beside Caleb, her face unreadable. Once home, she sent the children inside and turned to face him. Why did you do that? She asked. Because he insulted you. Men insult me all the time, Caleb. I'm used to it. Well, I'm not, he said, more sharply than intended. And I won't tolerate it. Not directed at you. Not while you're under my protection. Your protection? Joe's voice was flat. Is that all this is to you? An obligation? That's not Joe. You know that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Because you just called us your family in front of half the town. You threatened to destroy a man for insulting me. You're acting like she stopped herself. Like what? Like this is more than an employment arrangement. The words hung between them, heavy with implications. Neither had a dead voice. Caleb took a breath. Maybe it is. Joe went very still. Don't say things like that unless you mean them. I mean them. The words came easier than he expected. Joe, I didn't plan this. I didn't want this. But somewhere between finding you in that alley and today, things changed. You changed me. And he forced himself to continue. I care about you. About all of you. But you especially. Caleb. Joe's voice was painful. We can't. You know we can't. This is Montana Territory in 1884. What you're suggesting isn't just scandalous. It's dangerous. For both of us, but especially for my children. I know what I'm suggesting, and I know the risks. Do you? Joe stepped closer, her eyes blazing. Do you really? Because I've lived my entire life with these risks. I know what happens to black women who step out of line, who dare to think they can be equals, who... Her voice broke. I can't lose everything again, Caleb. I can't put my children through that. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to promise he'd protect them from everything, but he couldn't make that promise. Joe was right. The world was cruel, and there were dangers he couldn't control. So what do we do? He asked quietly. Joe wrapped her arms around herself. We keep things as they are. Employer and employee. Friends, if we're lucky, but nothing more. It's safer that way. Safer, Caleb repeated. But is it right? Right doesn't matter if we're dead or run out of territory. She was being practical, realistic, and smart, and it was breaking his heart. All right, he said finally, if that's what you want. It's not about want, Joe said softly. It's about survival. It's always about survival. She turned and walked into the house, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and red. He understood her fear. He respected her caution. But he also knew, with absolute certainty, that he was in love with Josephine Coleman. And somehow, someway, he was going to find a way to make this work. Summer settled over the Circle T like a warm blanket, bringing long days and prosperity. The cattle drive to market had been successful beyond expectations. Grace's projections had been, if anything, conservative. The ranch's reputation was growing, and Caleb found himself turning down offers to purchase cattle because he simply couldn't meet demand. But success came with complications. The incident with Vernon Pritchard had spread throughout the territory. Opinions were divided. Some ranchers respected Caleb's loyalty to his people. Others muttered about impropriety and questioned his judgment. A few, like Mrs. Chen and the town doctor, openly praised the Colemans' contributions to the community. The attention made Jo increasingly uncomfortable. She became more reserved in public, more careful about maintaining visible distance from Caleb. At the ranch, she retreated into professional efficiency, treating him with polite formality that hurt worse than any insult Vernon Pritchard could have hurled. The children noticed. "Why is Mama acting strange?" Samuel asked Caleb one evening as they sat on the porch. The boy had made this his special time with Caleb, and the rancher looked forward to it more than he'd admit. "She's just worried about some things," Caleb said carefully. "Worried about what?" "How did you explain prejudice and social constraints to a 4-year-old? About making sure you and your brother and sister are safe and happy." "But we are safe. We're here with you." The simple faith in those words gutted Caleb. "Yes, you are. And you always will be, Samuel. I promise you that." The boy leaned against him, content, and Caleb wrapped an arm around the small shoulders, feeling the profound weight of the promise he'd just made. The breaking point came in late July. A traveling preacher arrived in Redemption Ridge, setting up revival meetings that drew crowds from surrounding ranches. Caleb normally avoided such things. He had complicated feelings about religion after losing Martha, but Jo wanted to attend, and he couldn't let his family go alone. The meeting was held in a large tent on the edge of town. Families filled rough-hewn benches, singing hymns and listening to the preacher's fire and brimstone sermon about sin and redemption. Caleb sat with his family. He'd stopped pretending they were anything else and tried to focus on the message. But he was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers, the judgment radiating from certain sections of the crowd. The preacher, a thin man with wild eyes and a voice like thunder, built to his crescendo. "The Lord calls us to righteousness, to purity, to reject the temptations that lead us astray, to stand against those who would corrupt our communities with their—" His eyes landed on Caleb's family, unnatural arrangements. The tent went absolutely silent. Jo's hand tightened on Grace's shoulder. Thomas pressed closer to Javier, who'd accompanied them. Samuel looked confused. The preacher pointed directly at them. "I see among you those who flaunt God's natural order. A white man consorting with a colored woman, living in sin, corrupting innocent children with their depravity." Caleb stood slowly, his chair scraping loud in the silence. "Sit down," the preacher commanded. "You will hear God's judgment." "No," Caleb said quietly, but his voice carried through the tent. "I don't think I will." He turned to his family. "Let's go." "You cannot run from the Lord's truth," the preacher shouted. Caleb stopped, turned back. Every eye in the tent was on him. He could walk away, let the accusations stand, and maintain their fragile peace. Or he could do what was right. "Mrs. Coleman is my business partner and the manager of my household," Caleb said clearly. "Her children are members of my ranch family. There is nothing unnatural or sinful about offering help to those who need it, about providing employment and shelter, about treating people with dignity regardless of their color. You live together under one roof, and chaperoned, in a house with 6 ranch hands nearby, in a community that sees us regularly, conducting ourselves with perfect propriety." Caleb's voice was steel. "You want to see sin? Look at men who let children starve. Look at those who turn away from people in need. Look at those who judge without knowledge and condemn without understanding." He stepped closer to the platform. "I lost my wife 5 years ago. I thought I'd lost myself too. Then I met the Colemans, and I remembered what it meant to be human, to care about something beyond my own grief. They didn't corrupt me, preacher. They saved me." Jo made a small sound behind him. Caleb continued, his words now directed not at the preacher but at the assembled crowd. Some of you have been kind to my family. Thank you. Some of you have been judgmental. That's your choice. But understand that the Colemans are under my protection, now and always. They are part of the Circle T, and if that offends your sensibilities, then I invite you to never set foot on my land again. He turned back to his family. Now let's go. They walked out together, heads high, while the tent erupted in whispers behind them. The ride home was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Cleaner, somehow, honest. At the ranch, the children went inside while Caleb unhitched the wagon. He was securing the horses when Jo appeared beside him. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Probably not. You've made things worse. People will talk even more now. Let them talk. Caleb, Jo. He turned to face her. I'm done pretending. I'm done with caution and distance and acting like we're just employer and employee when we both know it's become more than that. I'm done hiding how I feel. How you feel, Jo repeated carefully. I love you, Caleb said simply. I'm in love with you. I love your children like they're my own. And I don't care who knows it. I don't care what they think, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise anymore. Jo stared at him, her expression cycling through shock, fear, hope, and something that might have been joy before settling on anguish. Caleb, we can't. The world won't let us. Then we'll change the world, or ignore it, or fight it. I don't care, Jo. I spent 5 years dead inside, and you brought me back to life. I'm not going back to that darkness. Not for anyone. And my children, what about them? They'll face hatred, violence, and things worse than words. They'll also face it with a father who loves them and will protect them with everything he has. Caleb stepped closer. I know I'm not James. I know I can never replace him. But I can love you and those children with everything I am. If you'll let me. Tears streamed down Jo's face. You're a fool, Caleb Thorne. I know. A stubborn, impossible fool. I know that too. And I love you for it. The words came out in a rush. God help me. I love you. I've been fighting it for months, trying to be sensible, trying to protect everyone. But I love you. Caleb pulled her into his arms, and Jo came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. He held her like she was precious and fragile and strong all at once, because she was all those things. So what do we do? Jo asked, her voice muffled. We get married, Caleb said simply. We make this official, legal, permanent. We give those children a complete family and each other a partner for whatever comes. Jo pulled back to look at him. Caleb, interracial marriage is illegal in most places. Even where it's not, the social consequences are worth it. You're worth it. They're worth it. He cupped her face in his scarred, work-roughened hands. Jo, I've lived through losing everything once. I survived it, but I didn't really live afterward. Not until you. I'm not going back to just surviving. I want to live. With you. Jo searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that he didn't fully understand what he was proposing. She found none. All right, she whispered. All right. Yes. Caleb kissed her, then soft and careful at first, then deeper as 5 years of loneliness and 6 months of restraint fell away. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Jo was smiling through tears. The children, she started. Will be thrilled, Caleb finished. Grace has been giving me pointed looks for months. Thomas asked Javier if I was going to become his father. Even Samuel has been calling me Pi when he thinks I'm not listening. Jo laughed, the sound bright and full of relief. Then I guess we're doing this. We're doing this. They stood together in the barn doorway as sunset painted the sky, and Caleb felt something he'd thought was lost forever: complete, profound, perfect contentment. Tomorrow will bring challenges. The world wouldn't suddenly become accepting. There would be fights ahead, social, legal, possibly physical. But tonight, they had each other. They had love. They had a family. And that was enough. The wedding took place in late August on a perfect Montana morning, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and the mountains standing sentinel under a cloudless sky. They kept it simple, private. Caleb had located a progressive minister 2 towns over who agreed to perform the ceremony. The guest list consisted of Javier, the ranch hands who'd become friends, Mrs. Chen from town, the sympathetic doctor, and a handful of other allies they'd accumulated. Grace stood as Joe's attendant, wearing a new dress that made her look suddenly, heartbreakingly grown up. Thomas and Samuel were ring bearers, both taking their duties with adorable seriousness. Joe wore a simple dress in deep blue, not white, as she'd been married before, but the color made her skin glow and her eyes shine. Caleb had never seen anything more beautiful. When the minister asked if anyone objected, there was only supportive silence. When Caleb said, "I do," he meant it with every fiber of his being. When Joe said, "I do," her voice was steady and sure. When they kissed as husband and wife, the assembled witnesses cheered, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowered, and the wind carried the scent of grass and possibility. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. Mrs. Chen had helped Joe prepare food. Javier played fiddle badly, but enthusiastically. The children ran wild, finally free to celebrate openly what they'd all known for months. As evening approached and guests departed, Caleb found himself on the porch with his new family. Joe sat beside him, her hand in his. The children played in the yard, their laughter rising into the twilight. "Caleb Thorne," Joe said softly, "what have we done?" "Something brave," he answered. "Something is right. Something worth whatever comes next." Grace approached the porch, her face serious. "Pa, can I call you that now?" The question hit Caleb like a physical blow. "I'd be honored if you did." "Pa, I've been calculating. With people angry about the wedding, we might lose some business. But I think if we diversify, maybe sell directly to markets in other territories, places where people won't know or care, we can actually increase profits." Caleb laughed, pulling the girl into a hug. "You're going to rule the business world someday. You know that." "I know," Grace said seriously, "but I'll do it from here. This is home." Thomas joined them, leaning against Caleb's knee. "Javier says I can start training the new colt, the black one with the white star." "That's fine. You've earned the responsibility." Samuel climbed into Caleb's lap, yawning. "Tell a story." So Caleb told a story improvised and rambling about a rancher who found a family in an alley and discovered that home wasn't a place, it was people. Samuel fell asleep before the ending, but the others listened raptly. When the children finally went to bed, Caleb and Joe remained on the porch, watching stars emerge. "Do you regret it?" Joe asked quietly, being honest at that revival, making this public. Caleb considered. "No. I regret we have to fight for something that should be simple. I regret that the world is the way it is. But I don't regret choosing you, choosing us, choosing love over fear. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile is." Joe leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you, Caleb, for seeing me in that alley, for being brave enough to care, for giving my children a father and a home." "Thank you," Caleb countered, "for being strong enough to accept help, for trusting me with your family, for loving me despite everything." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other in darkness and built something luminous together. Spring 1887 arrived at the Circle T Ranch with the enthusiasm of new life. Caleb stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house. They'd added 3 rooms to accommodate the growing family and surveyed his domain with satisfaction. The past 3 years hadn't been easy, but they'd been good. The ranch had thrived. Grace's instincts about diversification had proven prophetic. They now sold cattle to markets across 3 territories, and the Circle T's reputation for quality was unmatched. The ranch employed 20 hands, managed 15,000 acres, and town profits that made Caleb one of the wealthiest ranchers in Montana. More importantly, they'd weathered the social storm. There had been incidents of vandalism once, threatening letters twice, a few confrontations in town. But there had also been support. As people saw the Colemans' character, their contributions to the community, the strength of this unusual family, opinions shifted. Not everyone's, not completely, but enough. The law had changed too. Montana Territory had no specific laws against interracial marriage, and with growing progressive sentiment, what had been scandalous was slowly becoming merely unusual. Grace, at 13, was already handling significant portions of ranch management. She'd been approached by 2 universities with scholarship offers. She planned to accept one, study business, and return to expand the ranch into a regional empire. Thomas, at 10, was the finest horse handler Caleb had ever seen. Gentle, intuitive, and fearless, the boy had a reputation that brought buyers from hundreds of miles away specifically to purchase horses he'd trained. Samuel, at 7, was simply happy, healthy, bright, and possessed of an unquenchable curiosity about everything. He was currently fascinated by geology and insisted the ranch sat on ancient seabeds. He was probably right. And Joe? Caleb turned as his wife emerged from the house, and his heart still skipped exactly the way it had 3 years ago. She'd somehow become more beautiful. Confidence and security had erased years of hardship from her face. Caleb, she said, her voice holding that particular tone he'd learned meant important news. I need to tell you something. He pulled her close. What is it? Joe placed his hand on her stomach. I'm pregnant. 3 months along. The world stopped. You're where Caleb couldn't find words. We're having a baby, Joe confirmed, smiling at his shock. Due in late fall, the doctor thinks. Caleb sank onto the porch bench, overwhelmed. He'd lost a child once. Now he was being given another chance. Are you all right? Joe asked, concerned. I'm perfect, Caleb managed. Terrified, but perfect. Joe, his voice broke. Thank you. For this, for everything, for... She kissed him, silencing his rambling. We're in this together, remember. Always. Always, Caleb agreed. The children tumbled out of the house, arguing about something. Grace insisting mathematics proved her point. Thomas arguing experience trumped theory. Samuel just happy to be included. When they saw their parents' faces, they stopped. What happened? Grace asked, immediately alert. Joe and Caleb exchanged glances. You're going to have a brother or sister, Caleb announced. The reaction was instantaneous chaos. Grace shrieked with delight. Thomas whooped. Samuel jumped up and down yelling, Baby! 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 As Caleb watched his family celebrate, he thought about that day 3 years ago in a dusty alley behind a saloon. He'd been a dead man walking, going through motions, existing without living. Then he heard a prayer over bread crusts and made a decision. Pack your things. We're going home. At the time, he'd meant his ranch. Now he understood home had never been a place. Home was Joe's hand in his. Home was Grace's brilliant mind solving impossible problems. Home was Thomas's gentle way with frightened animals. Home was Samuel's endless questions and infectious joy. Home was this family they'd built from scraps and hope and stubborn, courageous love. Home was them. And as the Montana sun rose higher, casting gold across the land, Caleb Thorne held his family close and knew with absolute certainty that finding them in the alley wasn't chance or luck or fate. It was grace. Pure, unexpected, life-changing grace. And he'd spend the rest of his days being grateful for it. The end. Drop your story in the comments below. Your words matter. Your experience could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that love is always worth the risk, that family is what we choose to build, not just what we're born into, then do me a favor. Hit that like button so more people can find this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful tales of redemption, courage, and unexpected grace. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to open your heart, never too late to choose love over fear, never too late to go home. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing in their own alley, wondering if anyone sees them, if anyone cares, if things will ever get better. Be there, Caleb Thorne. See you in the next story. Until then, remember, home isn't a place. Home is the people worth fighting for. Drop those comments below. I read every single one. What did you think of Caleb's choice? Of Joe's courage? Of this family's triumph over prejudice? Tell me everything.